The correct sound for the graphemes in the Learn Reading Master course in order are Lesson 1. The 5 graphemes are R, T, N, I, and L. The sounds are T, N, I, O. Lesson 2, the grapheme S will say S. Lesson 3, A will say A. Lesson 4, D will say D. Lesson 5, C will say K. Lesson 6, E will say E. Lesson 7, M will say M. Lesson 8, P will say P. Lesson 9, B will say B. Lesson 10, ER will say Lesson 11, O will say O. Lesson 12, Y will say E. Lesson 13, E will say E. Lesson 14, A will say A. Lesson 15, O will say A. Lesson 16, F will say F. Lesson 17, O will say Ah. Lesson 18, U will say Lesson 19, V will say V. Lesson 20, A will say Lesson 21, G will say G. Lesson 22, C will say S. Lesson 23, A will say A. Lesson 24, U will say oo or U. Lesson 25, TI will say sh. Lesson 26, H will say h. Lesson 27, G will say j. Lesson 28, S will say z. Lesson 29, L will say ol. Lesson 30, K will say k. Lesson 31, W will say w. Lesson 32, I will say I. Lesson 33, AR will say R. Lesson 34, TH will say th. Lesson 35, SH will say sh. Lesson 36, OU will say Lesson 37, NG will say ng. Lesson 38, I will say I. Lesson 39, OR will say Lesson 40, CH will say ch. Lesson 41, OR will say or. Lesson 42, CK will say k. Lesson 43, NK will say nk. Lesson 44, EE will say E. Lesson 45, EA will say E. Lesson 46, X will say x. Lesson 47, PH will say f. Lesson 48, UR will say Lesson 49, Z will say z. Lesson 50, J will say j. Lesson 51, OU will say ow. Lesson 52, Y will say I. Lesson 53, AI will say A. Lesson 54. QU will say Kwa. Lesson 55. A will say I. Lesson 56. TU will say Ch or Chu. Lesson 57. OO will say Oo. Lesson 58. AR will say Lesson 59. AL will say Aw. Lesson 60. TH will say V. Lesson 61. AU will say Ah. Lesson 62. EA will say Eh. Lesson 63. AY will say A. Lesson 64. OA will say O. Lesson 65. OW will say O. Lesson 66. OW will say Ow. Lesson 67. CI will say Shh. Lesson 68. OO will say Lesson 69. IR will say Lesson 70. Y will say I. Lesson 71. OI will say Oi. Lesson 72. WH will say Wh. Lesson 73. AW will say Ah. Lesson 74. AR will say Air. Lesson 75. EW will say Ooh. Lesson 76. Y will say Yeah. Lesson 77. OY will say Oi. Lesson 78. WR will say Lesson 79. KN will say And Lesson 80. ED will say